Welcome to Drawn from Nature, a Linda Hall Library podcast with Dr. Eric Dorfman and Eric Ward.
Hello, Eric.
Hello, Eric.
I'm Eric Dorfman, president of Linda Hall Library.
And I'm Eric Ward, vice president for public programs at the Linda Hall Library.
What were you doing this weekend?
You know, I got out a little bit and did some hiking,
Oh, nice.
looking for birds. Didn't see very much of interest, but it's always fun to get out.
Right. So I was bringing the birds to me by working on my pollinator garden.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so this
How's that coming along?
It's going pretty well. I'm attracting maybe more baby rabbits than I am birds, but that's fine.
Well, those baby rabbits will someday attract hawks and owls.
Right, that's true. That's right. Feed a healthy population of raptors. So that's fun. I did see a new butterfly. I wish now I had looked it up and to see what it was. Black with these striking yellow.
Do you get a
bars
picture
on
of it?
Yeah, no. But that's okay. That's okay. And later on, I'd like to do some exploring more birds and pollinators and stuff.
Yeah,
Fun.
there are a lot of great places here in the metro.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe we should do an episode from out there. Maybe not when it's 93 out. But
No, we could wait for or until September, October.
yeah, that's
at some
a great
point.
idea.
Even in the Linda Hall Library Arboretum.
What a great idea. Let's do that.
We can just walk out the door and
There
we are.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. No, that would be great. 14 acres of urban loveliness.
Yes.
It'll be really good. So one of the other things I was doing, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I was reading Cicero over the weekend, which is not something
as one should.
Yes, as one should, but one normally doesn't do. But really found his discussion of Epicurean view of the world very interesting, which is the most akin to our modern world that I have seen in a long time. So it was very fascinating. And of course, that whole history of science thing is kind of one of the big things we do at the Linda Hall
Right.
Library, isn't it? And so I felt like I was doing my good deed over the weekend by learning about it,
Doing your homework. Yeah.
That's right. But also deeply fascinating.
And what a perfect person we have today joining us, Professor William Ashworth, longtime historian of science.
Right.
And a longtime consultant at the Linda Hall Library. So welcome, Bill.
Hello, Bill.
Thank you. My name is Bill Ashworth, and this is what my voice sounds like.
It's very good. We unfortunately can't show you folks a visual, but you'll get to know his voice.
Yeah, and Bill's someone I've known for almost 18 years now since I've been at the library, and we've had many great conversations. But while we were talking about history of science,
Yes,
as a field of study, Bill, what led you to becoming an historian of science?
Well, it was a little roundabout. I was a physics major in college and had always loved mathematics and physics. There was a summer vocational opportunity I had to work as a physicist. Worked at Argonne National Labs, in fact, not too far from here. And I discovered that I didn't want to do physics. It was a very limited kind of an investigation. So I sort of abandoned physics, went to law school for a year, dropped out of that, went into the Air Force because this was the Vietnam War and I had no choice if I wasn't going to go to school. And it was while in the Air Force that I corresponded with a friend of mine at the University of Wisconsin. And I told him that I was reading a book about John Kepler that I had found, a paper by Arthur Kessler, and that I found it really enthralling. We never got anything like that in my physics classes, and where we had no history at all. And so he wrote back and he said, you know, we have a whole department here at the University of Wisconsin. It's called the History of Science Department, and that's all they do. And
sounds amazing.
I was fascinated and attracted, and when I got out of the Air Force, in fact, before I got out, I applied to the school, was accepted, and this would be in 1970. I enrolled as a graduate student in the history of science, and it's been history of science kind of ever since.
Do you remember how you came across the Kepler book?
I
that the
There was a whole
local library?
No, there was a whole series. Of, I was a science nerd kind of in
Yeah.
high school, so there was a whole series called the Science Studies series that was put out in the late 1950s. At the time when we were worried about our kids, Sputnik had gone out, our kids knew no science, and so there was this intense move to try and write books for kids on science. And so one of the books they included in that series was Kessler's, which had already been written, but it was a cheap paperback, and I had all of them. I had books on soap bubbles and magnets and all that, and then I had Kepler. And
Wow.
So I just happened to be reading the book. I was on the flight line when I read it. I had it, for a long time, and I just had never thought of scientists as people with irrational emotions and odd beliefs, which Kepler certainly had in abundance. And so I was fascinated, and I actually have been fascinated ever since. The appeal of it has never gone away, fortunately.
The person who wrote that book wouldn't have had any idea that they were founding your career path.
No, they wouldn't. And,
Yeah.
they probably would have been appalled.
Now, but it's interesting because you say that there was no history taught in your physics course at all. I'm wondering what you think about that. Should we have more historical background or context when we're teaching these kinds of things?
You're jesting with this question?
Why?
Of course we should.
Well, but let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Where would it fit? Like how should this work in our university settings?
Well, it's a lot better now than it used to be. But when I was in school, there was no history of science taught in the schools in any form. There were departments, but the people who graduated from them were few and far between. I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
Right.
And it was an excellent school, but it just the historical insight was just lacking from most science courses as they were taught, and it's inexcusable, really.
Right.
Because if you don't know where we've been, it's hard to figure out where we're going to go. And if a scientist or a would-be scientist learns, why people believed in an Earth-centered universe, they weren't crazy, they had good reasons for doing that,
right.
And then what happened? Why do beliefs change? Why do you one day decide that you're going to believe in a different type of cosmology? And it's all stuff a scientist should know. Otherwise, he's not going to know why he believes what he believes. He's just going to accept it as truth, which is what everybody did.
Right, exactly.
So you were at the University of Wisconsin. You got your doctorate in the history of science.
I did.
What was your...
You can now call me Dr. Ashworth.
Dr. Ashworth.
Just now.
There's that. That's all.
What was your dissertation topic? What was...
I've always been kind of a generalist. I like all of which is not the way to advancement in this field. So I wrote a very vast topic on the impact of the historical revolution on the scientific revolution of the 17th century. That is, how did ways of doing history change in the 17th century, and how was that parallel to what was going on among scientists? And it was actually a pretty good thesis. There was, there was kind of a lack of historicism in historical thought up until the 17th century. That is, people didn't really see the classical Greece as being different from Renaissance Europe, from 17th century London, and the realization that, well, in fact, people are different. They have different beliefs for different reasons, and you have to understand that in order to go forward. And science does the same thing. They kind of shuck off the past, the Aristotelian past, and forge a new way. And so it was a good thesis. I'd never published it. It was too broad, but it was very educational.
And then you landed in Kansas City, in 1975?
1975.
Right.
At the University of Missouri, Kansas City.
That's right. That was a down year. There weren't very many jobs in the history of science in 1975. In fact, there were two. And I know the woman who got the one at Calgary, and I got the one here. And that was it. So I was pleased as heck to come here. Sure. And I've really enjoyed it ever since. I've been tempted to leave a few times, but I've never seized that temptation.
And the library was just a handy coincidence that it was there?
No, well, it's a coincidence in some sense. It wasn't, for me, it wasn't a coincidence. I mean, the reason I came here primarily was because of this library.
Wow.
They brought me over here as when I came to interview, and I met Joe Shipman, the former your predecessor here, and he showed me the Galileo that he just got and the things like that, and so that was, if they offered it to me, I was going to take it right there, and they did, and I did.
Wow. And of course, you've got your amazing library within our walls.
Yeah, well, I've always been not so much a book collector as I've been a reader, and I like to read my own books, and so I buy books, and I just prefer to work that way. So after all these years, I have a fairly formidable library, which will come your way someday.
Well, not too soon.
When did you begin your affiliation with the Linda Hall Library?
That was in 1978. The director, Joe Shipman, that I just mentioned, was the only authority on the history of science, and he was kind of an amateur. But still, he's the one who bought all the rare books, and then he died in 1977, and so his successor knew nothing about the history of science, so he hired a young librarian to do the library part of the rare book room. That was Bruce Bradley. And then he asked me if I would like to be a consultant to advise on what we should be buying and what we should do for exhibitions. And I said, sure. At that time, I was actually up in Madison on a leave teaching there for while someone was away. So I ran back and took this job. So Bruce Bradley and I started on the same day, and it's been a wonderful career.
46 years later, here we are.
Is that what it is?
Yeah,
oh,
wow.
geez, you had to say that. Yeah.
Leave it to Eric.
Yes.
It's interesting that you've been talking about if we don't know where we've been, how do we figure out where we're going? And I mean, to me, that's of course really resonant. Can you explore that a little bit more, especially in the history and the context of the history of science?
If you have no knowledge of your historical predecessors, you really don't know why people believed what they believed in the past. Most scientists who have no history education tend to think that, well, people were just stupid back then when they believed that the Earth was at the center, or when they believed that the blood didn't circulate, but it, was created in the liver and went out to all the parts of the body, and that was it.
Right.
So, but there are reasons why people believe that, and those reasons are understandable. You just have to put yourself back in time a little bit and see what people knew at the time, and what were the logical choices. And so, if you do that, you can kind of understand why people come up with an interpretation that they do. And then what you next should learn to understand is, well, what's involved in coming up with a new idea? Like when Copernicus proposes that the sun is at the center, what's going on? What are his reasons for doing so, and are there good reasons for not accepting it? And lots of people didn't believe in the heliocentric universe, and they had good reasons for it, because there's a lot that Copernicus couldn't explain, like physics. He couldn't explain why things move the way they do if the Earth is rotating as fast as it is. And so if you come to realize why people believe what they do, what their reasons are for it, then you inevitably apply that to your own beliefs. And so you come to understand, why do you believe in dark matter or whatever the current thing is, and what are the reasons? What are the arguments against it? And it just makes you more tolerant, more receptive to new ideas, and it's hard. When plate tectonics came in the 1960s.
Yes, exactly.
I was here in the 1970s, and I knew a lot of geologists that would have nothing to do with it. This is true with but it's not their fault. I mean, you grow up with a certain, what we in the field call a paradigm, a certain framework of ideas, and it's very difficult to just sort of throw that out and take a new one. And so what often happens, as Thomas Kuhn, who invented the word paradigm, as he told us, is, you got to die off. People have to die, and young guys have to come up, and young women, and that's how things change.
So is that, as we were talking, I was thinking, well, what does it take to shake somebody out of their paradigm? And maybe, and I was thinking about that. I mean, do you just have to wait them out? Is that
there's no single answer, because some people you cannot budge from from that. Some very smart people hold on to their old beliefs, for the rest of their lives. Some people, some older people, convert like that.
Right.
It's just an individual kind of thing. So I don't think there's any recipe. If there were, science would progress a lot faster. If there was a recipe whereby you could convince someone that, well, this view is better than your view, so therefore you ought to convert.
It's interesting because it makes me think what you're just saying now. The Anthropocene as a hypothesized geological time period was just rejected by the commission that decides those things. And of course, even internally within that panel, there was a lot of dissension and disagreement and disappointment when that was the result. And it's interesting, say comparing that to plate tectonics or climate change or blood circulation, things that are now seem more self-evident. They're not, at the time, they're much more, challenging, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
But time is the great converter.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Because I'm sure in 20 years, the Anthropocene is going to be, just like the Holocene is going to be, standard terminology. And,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So you just have to not be too impatient.
Well, 20 years seems like a long time to be patient.
Does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Think of what it must have felt like to Alfred Wegener,
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
So, of course. So it's hard to be patient when it's your theory that's on
And
the
he
line.
didn't live.
He didn't live. He never saw it.
I
That's
know.
right.
That's right.
He never saw it.
I read him in high school, actually.
Really?
Yes, I did. I was my aunt was an anthropologist and
Really?
gave me a copy of that, and I found it even then inspiring, and known that he hadn't lived to see it believed, which is a shame.
Evolution is another big
Right.
topic
Yes, of
that
course.
took several years, and there's still maybe some non-believers, but Darwin certainly lived to see evolution.
Well, and the response to both good and bad to his
publication of On the Origin of Species.
Yes. Yeah. Darwin was lucky. First of all, he had helped to have a brilliant theory. Really, in terms of utility, the nice thing about Darwin's theory of evolution is that people could right away use it, when they're classifying animals, for example. They could say, well, these are in the same family, so you can use it. So it had utility. So people who didn't really think about the big questions about what does it mean in terms of, God's presence in the world, it's just a useful theory. And then he lived to 1882, so he's got 21 years on his 23 years, I guess, for enough time for people to kind of assimilate what he's doing. And there were immediate critics, there were scientific critics, there were popular critics. The scientific critics, it took them 40 years really to go away entirely. It's not so much that people objected to evolution as that the idea of natural selection, this random process which kind of takes design out of the world. That was that bothered a lot of people, and that didn't go away immediately. It lasted well into this century.
And maybe like Kepler, he didn't have the benefit of genetics, so there were aspects of it he couldn't explain.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right. Absolutely. So that makes a nice story in science where you have things that Darwin can't explain. Then, at the same time, Mendel is discovering the principle of genetics, but Darwin doesn't know about this, and so suddenly in 1900, Mendel's rediscovered, and people can put genetics with evolutionary theory and get the new synthesis, as they tended to call it. So, it makes for a nice, happy ending.
Yes,
except it's not over.
Well, exactly, but thinking about social Darwinism and how it's been, call it evil, right? So it's been used for less ethical principles, and even Darwin lived to be able to say, I don't buy into this. So it's really interesting how you can put something out there, and then people will run with it in many different directions.
Yeah, well, social Darwinism is it's kind of a misnomer, as you know. It was really Herbert Spencer that sort of founded this movement, and Darwin would have nothing to do with it, and yet it had this panache of Darwin's name on it. So, but fortunately, it was a short-lived movement. I mean, by the by 1900 it was more or less over, and then eugenics is
Eugenics is
a
what I
different
was.
topic. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, and that rises a little bit later. But well, Darwin survived them all. So.
Well, that's right. Although, we were talking a little bit earlier before we started recording about AI and the opportunity to take this tool and use it for fell purposes as well as good, wonderful challenges in our world. And I wonder if you could compare it to eugenics, where you have this scientific principle or scientific tool, and you can use it for all different kinds of things.
Well, I'd have trouble comparing the two. I don't see the similarities so much. I mean, eugenics is it's a social program, and it's got specific recommendations about what we do in terms of breeding and producing superior humans, and I don't really see any of that in AI. I mean, AI could certainly be misused in the same way, but
that's kind of what I meant.
Right.
Hacking into our oil pipelines or something.
Yeah. Well, that's out of my field of expertise. So,
sure, fair enough. Fair enough. We'll get a pipeline hacker in next.
Yeah,
next
that's
time.
right.
Bill, you've curated, I don't know how many exhibitions while at the Linda Hall Library.
It's about 25 or something. 25.
One of my favorites was back in 2009, your Grandeur of Life exhibition on the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of On the Origin of Species. What I particularly liked about that was it was pre-Darwin stuff. That it was the road to On the Origin of Species.
I really enjoyed curating that exhibition. Well, I love Darwin. I taught him for 40 years, and when we got the chance to do the exhibition, I thought, the phrase at the very end of The Origin of Species is the grandeur of life. I forget what the entire context is, but that comes from him, and so I thought it'd be nice to do an exhibition that displays the grandeur of life and the inevitable result of it all. So I got to pick the 50 most beautiful books in the collection that first of all fit into the story that was required, but that the public would like to look at. I mean, remember the whole purpose of an exhibition is to bring people in and to amaze them and to educate them, and so I thought this would do all three. So we got to display things like our Temple of Flora, which is the most gorgeous garden book that's ever been produced, and Aldrovandi, our president's favorite Renaissance naturalist. But also we got to display the books that directly led up to the origin. So Lamarck and
Linnaeus
and George Cuvier, and then we could display a lot more of Darwin's books than with the Voyage of the Beagle, with the wonderful illustrations by the Goulds, by Elizabeth actually, and then the Darwin's other treatises on barnacles. He wrote 20 or so books, all of them important in their own way. So we get to show. So that was great, and rather than try and take it any further, we left him as the pinnacle. Which I think is a fitting way to end an exhibit.
Right.
So that was fun.
That's wonderful. I'm going to have a little random side comment. We were talking about, or question, Wegener and how he was not accepted. And we mentioned Linnaeus, who, of course, came up with the scientific binomial system that we still use today. Was he resisted? Was his contribution resisted during his lifetime, or was there uptake right away?
Well, it's a two-part question because he wrote on animals and he wrote on plants, and he did them rather differently. So, the zoological taxonomy, it wasn't all that new. People had been using binomial names, but they'd also been using trinomials and others. And so, simply standardizing that practice and then codifying the groups you're going to put them in. And people still they were using genera, the genus, but they didn't have a systematic breakdown of genera and of kingdoms and orders and families and kingdoms, whatever the seven things are. And so it was, it's incredibly useful. He was one of the most respected teachers in Europe. People came from all over to go to Uppsala to study with him, and so it wasn't much of a resistance to people. It was just such a, they adopted the zoological system immediately. The botanical was a little different because Linnaeus couldn't figure out how to classify plants naturally, as they would call it. So animals kind of fall, like mice and rodents, they all fall into a natural group. It's pretty easy to classify the animals. But plants, you've got flowers that look the same on shrubs and trees and herbs, and so what do you do? So he couldn't figure out a natural system, one comparable to animals, so he chose an artificial system, one in which you just you count the stamens on the flower. If it's got one stamen, it goes in this family. If it's got two stamens, it goes in this one. And so, completely artificial, but incredibly easy to use.
Right.
Because the naturalist just has to go out and get a flower. 3 stamens. It goes in that box right there. And so the artificial system was debated for a long time. And also there's the fact that it was a sexual system.
Right.
Because these are sexual parts. And so the idea that, first of all, that plants have sexual organs, which is a recent discovery at the time, that was a little shocking to people. And then to actually use that as a way of classifying them was a little bit risque in some circles. So there was resistance. And eventually in the 19th century, they gave up the entire system when they discovered a natural system. They kept the binomial names that he used, but the names of the families and the orders and things, they changed.
Interesting.
As a result of that.
Oh, wow.
But he didn't have nearly the resistance that Darwin did, or Lamarck. Lamarck's much worse because his Lamarck was resisted totally. He had very few followers in his own lifetime.
Well, and I mean, even when I was learning ecology and evolution at the University of California, San Diego, we were taught Lamarck was an interesting novelty. And it wasn't only until a bit later and not that much later actually, that he was sort of let out of jail, and just there were ways that ontogeny could influence.
Yes, but that's a very recent thing. For 150 years or so, he was. Well, that's not quite correct because, so the way the chronology worked, he dies in 1829, something like that.
Right.
So he was resisted by George Cuvier, who's a great French naturalist, and much more famous than Lamarck, and absolutely opposed to evolution. So Lamarck went in the tank for a while, and then and Darwin objected to the passing of acquired characters to offspring. So but then around 1900, when people began to resist natural selection, they said, well, maybe Lamarck was onto something. That seemed a more compatible kind of evolution. So Lamarckianism has an uptake. And then it disappears by 1920, and then, as you say, more recently, people are finding that, well, there are certain occasions when genes can pass on to the offspring, genes that are acquired can get into the genome. So, yeah.
Amazing.
So it is amazing.
Yeah. You mentioned the Darwin quote, "Grandeur of Life," for an exhibition, and you know that we've, for this podcast, used an Audubon quote drawn from nature. And the reason we did that really is because we wanted to explore people's relationship, their personal relationship to the natural world. And you've studied many people and many centuries of thinking about their relationship in part to the natural world. And just wondering about yours. How do you personally relate to the natural world, and how do you, on an individual level, take what it has to offer?
Well, I love nature. I love being outdoors. I've been a hiker and a camper since I was a little Cub Scout, and my wife and I have gone on many hiking trips and camping trips, and it's just a very peaceful way to spend your day, outside the library and in nature's library. It's so I don't know if that has had any effect on what I do, but it certainly has made me sympathetic to the people, for example, that I exhibit. The phrase "drawn from nature" is I wished I had done an exhibit with that title because it's a great phrase, and you could you could do an interesting exhibit of people whose kind of life goal was to draw from nature in the sense of draw. I mean, that's
Right,
observe
some
nature,
illustration.
right? Because it's a very significant point in the Renaissance, in the 1550s, when suddenly naturalists take it as kind of their mandate that you draw from nature. You don't draw from a book anymore. And so, and we have lots of books like by Pierre Bellon and others in which right on the title page it says portraits of birds drawn from life, drawn from nature.
Right.
And and you see that right up to Darwin's time and later. The people that believe that if you want to understand nature, you have to go out into nature and you have to record nature, draw nature, and then write nature as you observe it. That's right.
Yes, that's right. And of course, Audubon had the advantage. Also, he knew what it all tasted like. I mean, he went out and ate everything. Yeah. What you talk about being more sympathetic to the things and the subjects through personal observation, it must give you a extra sense of breaking down the barriers of years between what you experience and what somebody else might write about. I always love doing that, like reading old natural history texts or old, in fact, even cultural history texts when I'm in the context. I'll read something if I'm in Paris, I'll want to read something about the history.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I will add in, if I might, that the next best thing to going out into nature and seeing it firsthand is to hold a book written by somebody in 1550 that has done this and has written this. And it is nowhere near as satisfying as looking at it in an online version that somebody has scanned. And I recognize the vital importance of digitizing our world. But for me, the world of rare books is a wonderful intermediary between the nature itself and ourselves. And so I don't think I could really live without it.
Right.
Mm. Well, let me ask you this. We'll narrow it to natural history. What's your favorite natural history rare book in the Linda Hall Library collection?
Well,
if you had to choose one.
On an ideological basis, it would be Darwin's Origin. I mean, that's the most important book written in the last 300 years, I suspect. The most magnificent book is the one I mentioned before, The Temple of Flora.
Well, maybe that would be a better way to phrase that question.
Right, and just because it's, the whole story of it, the poor guy who put it together commissioned these lithographs and engravings from the best artists and went broke and died in the poorhouse because nobody would buy his book. And so here we have this wonderful, pretty original copy of it. And so it just has a book that has a rich history like that is.
And can you tell people in a few words what the book is about?
Oh, sorry. Yes, the Temple of Flora is it's actually subtitled as the Sexual System of Linnaeus. So it's about trying to teach the new system, but the thing that everybody comes to when they look at this book are the about 30 large, maybe 24 inches. Engravings that are both hand-colored, they're mezzotints, they're aquatints, they're every kind of print you can think of, commissioned individually from very good artists and very expensive to produce, which is why he went broke. But the collection is the most magnificent thing you'll ever see. You certainly have seen some of the images, the tulips and the roses appear on Hallmark cards all the time. Yes, of course. So, but the original is just beyond compare. So,
Bill, I have to ask you, before we end the conversation, about your Scientist of the Day blog post.
How about that?
When did you start that?
Well, I actually started it as an email in 2009. I started it the same year that we did the exhibit. And
I know it's been,
Darwin was born on February the 12th, or the anniversary was February the 12th, 2009. So on that day, I wrote my first anniversary email about Darwin.
Oh, very good.
And then I just kind of kept it up. And then in 2014, they asked me to do it for the library's webpage and call it the Scientist of the Day. So what this is a daily, weekday column about a scientist who's either born on that day or died on that day or did something on that day. And and it's a kind of a mini biography intended not to be a complete biography, but just to introduce people to people and kind of show them how science works and what's fun about it and what's tragic about it in some cases. And so I've done it for coming up on 10 years. This October the 20th will be 10 years of Scientists of the Day.
And when you say, and this titled Scientists of the Day, it is daily.
Yes.
As well. You haven't missed a day, right?
I have not missed a day.
That's amazing.
The library has missed a few days. So,
No, it can't be.
When the library shuts down, I shut down. But it's every working day of the library. So have not missed a day.
That's amazing. Really, it is. And of course, as you say, you get into their personalities. You get to know these people a little bit as you read these posts.
Right. For me, it's a perfect outlook. I think I mentioned at the outset that I'm kind of a generalist, but you can't be a professional generalist. That doesn't work. But in this case, I can let that out, and I can spend a day with one person and read some of his books and look at the secondary material on it, and then I'm done with it, and I do somebody different the day after that. And I enjoy that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're very entertaining as well as educational. And you include 3 or 4 or so images as well.
Yes, I have usually a half a dozen images for each one. So
right. I know they're incredibly popular part of our website.
Professor Ashworth, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it a great deal.
Lovely to have you. So there he goes, out the door. Bye, Bill. That was great. That was really so, this is somebody that, of course, we know, but so interesting to hear his full take on it.
Yeah, I've learned a lot. He's been at the library for a number of years, and I've really enjoyed his exhibitions throughout the years as well. And several of them are online on our website at lindahall.org.
And one of the things that resonates with me most is his talking about needing to contextualize what we're doing now by thinking about the people and the ideas that have fomented to make us who we are today. And he really makes a great argument for the history of science.
Right. That even the ideas and beliefs that have since been disproven. I liked what he said about how, it was, these weren't stupid people.
No, that's right. Well,
and made a lot of sense to them. Yeah. And, they had a reason, to them, a very good reason for believing what they did.
Well, it's also sort of a macrocosm of the scientific process on an individual level, right? As a society, we make mistakes, we move on, the process gets refined, or sometimes one brilliant person or idea can move it into a completely different direction. You think about the study of animal behavior and ecology in a more, which is of course my background, in a more robust and systematic way from which maybe started in the 60s. So there's all kinds of things but really we really do need to know where we've been to keep going forward.
It makes me curious about what do we believe now that people 100 years, 200 years from now will look back on and say, what were these people thinking? I know.
It's a little bit like those 1920s movies that predict the future, which are kind of laughable to us now.
I'm still waiting on the flying cars.
Well, you may not have to wait too far for that. I want one.
Me too. So. It would help with a commute home.
Right.